I walked into Fulton County Family Court fully prepared to sign away everything I had spent a decade building. My cheating husband wanted our $1 million Buckhead mansion, total control of his tech startup, and full custody of our 2 children just to avoid paying a single cent of child support. My own mother sat next to me, her nails digging into my arm, hissing at me to give him exactly what he wanted, so I would not embarrass her in front of our church congregation. So I did. I picked up the pen and signed my life away while my father-in-law laughed loudly from the gallery. What none of them realized was that by taking my assets, they had legally shackled themselves to a massive federal fraud investigation. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the ultimate betrayal while holding the winning hand. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom clicked shut behind us, sealing me inside what felt like an execution chamber. Across the polished mahogany table sat Terrence, my husband of 10 years, wearing a custom-tailored suit paid for by a company I helped build from the ground up. He leaned back in his leather chair, exuding an arrogance that made my stomach turn. Next to him sat his high-priced attorney, aggressively tapping a gold pen against a stack of legal documents, as if rushing me to my own funeral. In the gallery directly behind Terrence sat Sierra. She was his 25-year-old former assistant, now his pregnant mistress. She was deliberately rubbing her swollen belly and casting victorious smirks in my direction every time the judge looked down at his files. Next to her sat Harrison Caldwell, Terrence's father, and a prominent Atlanta real estate tycoon, looking at me like I was a piece of trash stuck to his expensive Italian leather shoes. "Your Honor," Terrence's lawyer announced, his voice booming across the quiet room. "My client is asking for a complete and total transfer of all marital assets. This includes sole ownership of the Buckhead mansion, 100% of the equity in Caldwell Innovations, and primary physical custody of their 2 minor children. Terrence will generously allow Jasmine supervised weekend visits, provided she complies with a strict non-disparagement agreement." The sheer audacity of the demands was breathtaking. Terrence did not want our children. He had barely spent 10 minutes a day with them when we lived under the same roof, preferring to spend his evenings entertaining Sierra. He only wanted custody to ensure I could not touch his wealth through child support. I felt a sharp, stinging pain in my left forearm. My mother, Yvonne, had shifted closer to me, her manicured acrylic nails biting deep into my skin. "Sign the papers, Jasmine," my mother whispered harshly, her voice vibrating with a toxic mix of panic and anger. "Do not drag this out to a trial and make a spectacle of us. Men cheat. It is a fact of life. You could not keep your husband happy, and now you have to take your punishment gracefully." I stared at the woman who brought me into this world, the woman who was supposed to be my safe harbor. "Mom, he is trying to take my children," I whispered back, keeping my voice perfectly level so the judge would not hear. Yvonne scoffed quietly, leaning closer to my ear. "He just wants to win. Let him win. Harrison Caldwell just pledged $50,000 to the new youth wing at our church. I am not losing my seat on the senior deaconess board because my divorced, bitter daughter decided to throw a tantrum over a failed marriage. Sign the papers so the pastor does not have to hear about this ugly mess." She chose her social standing in the church over her own daughter and grandchildren. It was the ultimate betrayal delivered with the cold precision of a woman who had spent her entire life prioritizing appearances over actual love. I looked away from her and focused on the thick stack of documents resting on the polished wood in front of me. From the gallery, Sierra let out a soft, mocking laugh, leaning her head on Harrison's shoulder to whisper something in his ear. Harrison caught my eye and mouthed the word pathetic. The judge cleared his throat, peering over his reading glasses with a serious expression. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, addressing me directly and ensuring the court reporter documented every single word. "Your legal counsel has reviewed these documents, but I must ask you personally, do you fully understand the terms of this surrender? You are waiving all rights to the marital home, forfeiting any stake in the startup, and agreeing to the custody arrangement presented by the petitioner. Once you sign this binding agreement, You cannot claim ignorance of the financial liabilities and asset transfers contained within these pages. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this signature? I looked at Terrence. He raised his chin, a smug grin spreading across his face, believing he had completely broken me. I looked at Sierra, who was practically bouncing in her seat with greedy anticipation, eager to move into the house I had decorated. Finally, I looked down at the thick stack of papers. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my days tracking down hidden funds, exposing money laundering schemes, and dissecting complex financial lies for a living. Terrence and his father thought I was just a quiet, obedient wife who would blindly walk away empty-handed. They thought their aggressive tactics and my mother's immense pressure had frightened me into submission. But I knew exactly what was buried in those pages. I picked up the heavy pen. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, clearly looking Terrence right in the eye. "I am absolutely certain." My mother Yvonne let out a breath she had been holding, an exaggerated sigh of relief that echoed in the quiet courtroom. "Thank the Lord," she muttered, smoothing down her designer skirt. "Finally, we can move past this embarrassment." I handed the pen back to the clerk. Harrison let out a booming laugh that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. He did not care about courtroom decorum. He never cared about anything that did not directly serve his ego or his bank account. "Smartest thing you have ever done, girl," Harrison sneered, leaning over the wooden railing separating the gallery. "You were never built for the Caldwell Empire anyway. Terrence needs a wife who understands business, not some bean counter who questions every expense." I did not respond. I stood up carefully, gathering my purse. My silence was not submission, it was strategy. Outside the courtroom, the humid Atlanta air hit me immediately. I was walking toward the parking garage, eager to put distance between myself and the toxic cloud of the Caldwell family, when a perfectly manicured hand blocked my path. It was Brooke, Jamal's wife, my white sister-in-law who had spent the last 5 years treating me like a fascinating but slightly dangerous sociological experiment. "It is for the best," Jasmine Brooke said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of condescending pity she perfected at her country club luncheons. She tilted her head, giving me a sad smile. "Terrence really needs a woman with a softer energy. You have always been so intimidating and aggressive. It is exhausting for a man like him. Sierra is just more fitting for the circles the Caldwells move in now." I stopped. I looked at Brooke, taking in her expensive tennis outfit and the massive diamond on her finger. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the angry black woman reaction she was so clearly trying to provoke. "A softer energy," I repeated softly. "Just like how your father paid off Jamal's $200,000 gambling debts in Vegas last year, so you would not file for divorce." Soft energy indeed, Brooke. Or maybe it is just the quiet energy of bought silence. Brooke's pale skin turned a blotchy crimson. She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Before she could find a response, the heavy courtroom doors swung open. Terrence emerged, flanked by his lawyer and his father. Sierra was clinging to Terrence's arm, waving the signed property deed like a winning lottery ticket. She marched right up to me, snatching the document from Terrence's hand to flaunt it in my face. "Thanks for the house," Jasmine Sierra smirked, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Do not worry, I will make sure to completely redecorate your tacky home office. It is going to make a beautiful nursery for a real Caldwell heir." I looked at the young woman who thought she had just won the ultimate prize. She had no idea she was holding a grenade with the pin already pulled. "Enjoy the house, Sierra." I smiled, a genuine warm smile that clearly unsettled her. "Just make sure you read Appendix B before you start knocking down walls." I turned and walked away, leaving Sierra staring blankly at the legal documents in her hand. My heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement. I reached my car, an older model Honda Civic that Terrence constantly complained was an embarrassment to his image. I slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors. Before I could even start the engine, my phone buzzed. It was Elijah, my attorney. I answered, putting him on speaker. "Tell me it is done," I said, my voice steady. Elijah let out a sharp laugh. "It is done, Jasmine. The judge stamped the final decree 5 minutes ago. They were in such a rush to get you out of the picture, they did not even question the rush processing. Terrence and Sierra officially assumed 100% liability for Caldwell Innovations and the Buckhead property. My phone vibrated with a new text message. I swiped the screen. It was from Terrence. "Kids' tuition at the academy is on you now. Good luck covering that on a miserable accountant's salary. Do not expect a dime from me or my father." I stared at the message. Terrence was so predictable, so consumed by his own arrogance he never bothered to look beneath the surface. He saw me as a quiet, obedient wife who processed payroll and balanced budgets. He forgot that I am a forensic accountant. I spend my professional life tracking down hidden assets, exposing corporate money laundering, and dissecting complex financial lies. I opened my laptop, resting it on the steering wheel. I connected to my secure hotspot and opened an encrypted folder on my desktop. The file was labeled Caldwell SBA Fraud PDF. It contained hundreds of pages of documentation: wire transfers, shell company registrations, fake payroll records. Everything Harrison and Terrence had done to secure millions in federal relief funds for a tech product that did not exist. I navigated to a secure portal I had set up weeks ago. The recipient was a direct contact at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I hit send. The upload progress bar filled quickly. 100%. Transmitted. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the courthouse parking lot. The Caldwells thought they had taken everything from me. They had no idea they had just willingly locked themselves inside a burning building. I drove straight to my mother's house in Cascade Heights. Yvonne had insisted I stay with her for the weekend while I found a new place. I needed a few days to get the kids settled before transitioning to my new apartment. When I pulled into the driveway, my stomach tightened. There on the pristine wraparound porch sat 3 large black trash bags and a cardboard box. My emergency bags, the ones I had packed yesterday. I parked and walked up the steps. The front door was locked. I knocked loudly. "Mom, open the door." I could hear her voice inside. She was on the phone, her tone high-pitched and sickeningly sweet. "Oh yes, Harrison, I completely agree. It is a tragedy, but Terrence deserves happiness. We certainly will not let this disrupt the church building fund. You know you have my full support." I banged on the window. "Mom." The lock clicked and the door opened a few inches. Yvonne stood there blocking the entrance. She looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and panic. "Keep your voice down, Jasmine," she hissed, glancing nervously at the neighbors' houses. "What are you doing making a scene on my porch?" "Why are my bags outside?" I asked, gesturing to the trash bags. "You said I could stay here until Monday." Yvonne crossed her arms, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Things change. Harrison Caldwell just called me. He pledged $50,000 to the new youth wing at the church. He made it very clear that any public support for you would be viewed as a personal insult to his family." I stared at her, trying to comprehend the sheer depth of her betrayal. "You are kicking me out because Harrison Caldwell made a donation to the church. I am not losing my seat on the senior deaconess board because my divorced daughter is sleeping on my couch." Yvonne snapped, her voice rising defensively. "I have a reputation to maintain in this community. I cannot have people whispering that my daughter could not keep her husband from straying. Find a motel. Go stay with one of your little friends. Just get off my porch before the neighbors start talking." I looked at the woman who had raised me. The woman who attended every Sunday service wearing a different designer hat, always preaching about family values and Christian love. "You chose a church pew over me," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Just like you chose to drain my college fund to bail out Dad's secret family 15 years ago, so the church would not find out he had an illegitimate child. You have always preferred a comfortable lie over a difficult truth. Do not you dare bring up the past." Yvonne pointed a manicured finger at me. "I did what I had to do to keep this family respectable. Something you clearly know nothing about. I would rather not have a daughter who gets dumped for a 25-year-old assistant than let you drag my name through the mud." I picked up the cardboard box and grabbed the handles of 2 trash bags. Enjoy your front row seat at church, Mom, I said, walking back to my car. Make sure you wear your best hat. You are going to need it when the cameras show up. I did not wait for her response. I loaded my bags into the trunk and drove away. I did not go to a cheap motel. I drove downtown to Midtown Atlanta, pulling into the secure underground parking of a luxury high-rise. The security guard nodded respectfully as I swiped my key fob. I had leased this apartment 3 months ago using funds from a private consulting gig Terrence knew nothing about. It was highly secure, anonymous, and perfectly equipped for what was coming next. I was not the broke, desperate ex-wife they all thought I was. I was the architect of their destruction, and I was just getting started. A month passed, 4 weeks of silence from my family and constant gloating from Terrence. He was currently living in the Buckhead mansion, with Sierra throwing lavish parties to celebrate his newly acquired sole ownership of the company. I received a text from him on a Thursday afternoon. Dropping the kids off is too inconvenient today. Sierra is picking out new marble for the kitchen. Come get them yourself if you want to see them. I drove to the mansion, the house I had spent years turning into a home. The driveway was packed with luxury cars. Terrence was hosting a housewarming party, combined with a celebration for his new round of funding. I walked through the front doors, ignoring the stares of Atlanta's elite. The house was loud, filled with music and the clinking of champagne glasses. I found my children in the living room looking miserable. Terrence had not even bothered to hire a babysitter for the party. Sierra spotted me from across the room. She was holding a crystal flute, her pregnant belly on full display in a tight designer dress. She strutted over, a triumphant smirk on her face. Brooke was trailing right behind her, holding a plate of hors d'oeuvres. Look who decided to show up. Sierra laughed loudly, ensuring the guests nearby could hear. Coming to collect your things. Terrence said I could throw away whatever I did not want. Brooke chimed in, taking a delicate bite of a crab puff. You really should leave the wine collection, Jasmine. Sierra has a much more refined palate than you do. What are you going to do with vintage Bordeaux in whatever little apartment you are renting now? I ignored Brooke and looked directly at Sierra. I am just here for my children. But since you mentioned it, I left the heavy brass key on the kitchen island. Sierra frowned. Key? To what? The basement safe, I said smoothly. The one hidden behind the wine cellar. Inside are all the tax ledgers and offshore account tokens Harrison helped Terrence set up. Since you demanded 100% ownership of this house and the business in court, you own the safe and everything inside it. Guard it with your life, Sierra. Sierra's eyes lit up with greed, clearly assuming the safe contained hidden cash or jewelry. She practically snatched the imaginary key from the air. Thanks for the tip, Jasmine. Do not worry, I will take excellent care of my property. I turned away, gathering my children. Sierra had no idea I had just established a verbal confirmation in front of witnesses that she had assumed physical control of federal evidence. As I walked toward the door, I heard Harrison's booming voice over the music. He was standing on the grand staircase holding a microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Harrison called out, silencing the crowd. I want to make a toast to my son Terrence, who finally shed the dead weight holding him back and is now taking Caldwell Innovations to a $50 million valuation. The crowd erupted in applause. I saw my mother Yvonne standing near the front, clapping enthusiastically, smiling up at Harrison. I stopped. I told the kids to wait by the door. I walked slowly through the crowd, my eyes fixed on Terrence, who was standing near the bottom of the stairs. I stopped right in front of him, pouring myself a glass of water from a passing tray. Congratulations, Terrence, I said, my voice carrying just enough for the people immediately around us to hear. A $50 million valuation is impressive, almost as impressive as using this house as collateral to secure a $5 million loan from the Small Business Administration for a tech product that does not exist. The speed of that government disbursement was truly remarkable. Terrence's face dropped. The smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by sheer panic. How do you know about that? Before he could demand an answer, he waved over the elite catering manager, wanting to distract the surrounding guests with a display of wealth. Bring the bill for the champagne, he ordered loudly, pulling out his Black American Express card. Let us keep the celebration going. The catering manager ran the card through the wireless terminal. A sharp beep echoed in the sudden quiet around us. "I am sorry, Mr. Caldwell," the manager said, looking confused. It declined. Terrence snatched the card back, his face reddening. "Run it again. The machine is broken." The manager swiped it again. Another beep. Declined. Harrison, noticing the commotion, marched down the stairs, pulling out his own platinum card. "Use mine." Terrence must have hit his daily limit. The manager swiped Harrison's card. Beep. Declined. The manager looked at the terminal, his eyes widening. "Sir, the bank code says account frozen. Federal mandate." The music suddenly seemed too loud against the dead silence of the guests. Whispers started rippling through the room. Investors began checking their phones, exchanging nervous glances, and quietly backing toward the exit. I smiled, taking a sip of my water. "Have a wonderful housewarming, Terrence." I turned and walked out the door with my children, the sound of rising panic echoing behind me. I turned and walked away, leaving Sierra staring blankly at the legal documents in her hand. My heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement as I walked toward the parking garage, eager to put distance between myself and the toxic cloud of the Caldwell family. I reached my car, an older model Honda Civic that Terrence constantly complained was an embarrassment to his image. I slid into the driver's seat and pulled the heavy door shut, blocking out the humid Atlanta afternoon. The interior felt like an oven, but to me, it was an absolute sanctuary. I gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel, taking a deep, slow breath. For the past hour, I had played the role of the defeated, submissive wife perfectly. I had let them insult me, demean me, and strip me of what looked like everything I owned. But the performance was over now. Before I could even insert the key into the ignition, my phone lit up on the passenger seat. The screen displayed the name Elijah. He was my attorney, and the only person in the world who knew the entire scope of what had just transpired in that courtroom. I tapped the screen to answer, placing him on speakerphone. "Jasmine, tell me you made it out of there without slapping somebody," Elijah said, his voice vibrating with a frantic kind of energy. I smiled, staring out the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking garage. "I made it out, Elijah," I told him. Sierra practically snatched the property deed out of my hands. Harrison laughed in my face and told me I was never built for their empire. It was a textbook Caldwell farewell. I heard the sound of rustling paper on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp exhale of pure professional disbelief. "Jasmine, it is done," Elijah said. "I am staring at the digital copies right now. The judge stamped the final decree less than 5 minutes after you walked out of those double doors. They were in such a rush to finalize the transfer and cut you out of the picture that Terrence's high-priced lawyers did not even do a basic secondary review of the standard boilerplate attachments." My heart did a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. "So the assumption of liability clause remained perfectly intact?" I asked. "Intact and legally binding." Elijah laughed, a sound of pure triumph. When Terrence and his pregnant mistress arrogantly demanded complete sole ownership of the Buckhead mansion and total equity in Caldwell Innovations, they did not just take the assets. By signing Appendix B, they officially and irrevocably assumed all debts, back taxes, and hidden liabilities attached to those properties and corporations. "You are completely clean, Jasmine. Your name is wiped from the company ledger and the property title. You are legally shielded from everything that is about to happen." A wave of profound relief washed over my entire body. For months I had been carrying the weight of a massive secret, knowing that one wrong move could land me in federal prison right alongside my cheating husband and his corrupt father. But now the shackles were completely off. "Thank you, Elijah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for making sure the paperwork was bulletproof. You provided the math, Jasmine." "I just provided the legal wrapper," Elijah replied. "Go get your kids settled and keep your head down. The storm is going to hit them sooner than they think." I ended the call and leaned my head back against the headrest, staring at the gray fabric of the car roof. The Caldwells thought they were so untouchable. They thought their wealth and their connections made them immune to consequences. They thought a quiet forensic accountant would just sit back and let them drain the life out of her. They were so blinded by their own greed that they practically sprinted into the trap I had laid for them. My phone chimed, breaking the silence. I picked it up and saw a text message from Terrence. I stared at his name on the screen, feeling a familiar spike of disgust. I opened the message. "Just a reminder that the kids' tuition at the academy is completely on you now," Terrence wrote. "You wanted to play hardball in the marriage, so now you can deal with the reality of being a single mother. Good luck covering those private school bills on your miserable accountant's salary. Do not expect a single dime from me or my father. You are officially cut off." I read the message twice. The sheer petty cruelty of it was staggering but completely unsurprising. Terrence had just acquired $1 million mansion and a tech startup valued at tens of millions of dollars, yet his first instinct was to ensure the mother of his children suffered financially. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to realize how small and powerless I was without the Caldwell money. He wanted me to feel the crushing weight of a miserable accountant's salary. I let out a soft laugh that echoed in the quiet car. A miserable accountant's salary. Terrence had never respected my profession. He thought accounting was just boring data entry for people who lacked the charisma to be real business leaders. He had no idea what forensic accounting actually entailed. He had no idea that while he was sleeping with his assistant, and while his father was buying politicians, I was quietly mapping out every single fraudulent transaction they had ever executed. I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat and reached into the back, taking my laptop from its protective sleeve. I rested the silver computer on the steering wheel, flipping the screen open. The familiar glow illuminated the dim interior of my car. I connected the laptop to my secure encrypted mobile hotspot. My fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through a maze of hidden folders and password-protected drives. I opened the Final Destination folder. Right in the center of the screen sat a single large digital document. I had named it Caldwell S.B.A. Fraud File. Inside that file was the culmination of 3 months of agonizing, meticulous undercover work. It contained hundreds of pages of irrefutable evidence. There were screenshots of wire transfers moving millions of dollars in federal Paycheck Protection Program loans directly into Terrence's personal offshore accounts. There were property records proving Harrison Caldwell had used his flagship commercial buildings as collateral for fraudulent Small Business Administration grants. There were fake payroll ledgers, phantom employee Social Security numbers, and receipts for luxury vehicles bought with stolen government funds. It was a masterpiece of corporate sabotage, and it was completely undeniable. I opened my secure email client. I composed a new message, leaving the subject line and the body of the email completely blank. I attached the massive digital file. In the recipient field, I typed the direct private email address of a senior special agent at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. An agent I had been quietly corresponding with for weeks under the protection of the federal whistleblower program. I sat there for a moment, my finger hovering over the trackpad. This was the point of no return. Once I clicked this button, the Caldwell empire would begin to crumble. The mansion, the cars, the country club memberships, the church donations, it would all be seized. Terrence would lose his freedom. Harrison would lose his legacy. Sierra would lose her stolen luxury. Brooke would lose her comfortable delusion. I thought about my mother digging her nails into my arm, telling me to take my punishment. I thought about Terrence demanding my children just to avoid child support. I thought about the miserable accountant's salary he had just mocked me for. I took one final deep breath and pressed down on the trackpad. The progress bar flashed across the screen, green and rapid. Transmission complete. The file was gone. The evidence was in federal hands. The match had officially been struck and thrown into the gasoline. I closed the laptop, sliding it back into its sleeve. I finally put the key into the ignition, hearing the old engine rumble to life. I pulled out of the courthouse parking lot, merging onto the busy Atlanta streets. I was driving toward an uncertain future, but for the first time in 10 years, I was completely free. The dark clouds that had been gathering over the Atlanta skyline finally broke open as I navigated the heavy traffic on Interstate 20. The rain came down in thick sheets, washing over the windshield of my old Honda Civic. I was driving toward Cascade Heights, where my mother Yvonne lived. I had packed 3 emergency bags the night before, knowing that the court proceedings would be unpredictable and that I would need a temporary place to stay before I could safely transition into the next phase of my plan. Yvonne had reluctantly agreed to let me sleep on her guest room couch for the weekend. I turned onto her pristine street where massive oak trees lined the perfectly manicured lawns of the historic neighborhood. This was an enclave where image was the only currency that truly mattered. I pulled into the wide driveway of my mother's large brick house, putting the car in park. Through the relentless downpour, I peered through my wet windshield and felt a sudden sharp drop in my stomach. There, on the edge of the wrap-around porch, entirely exposed to the blowing rain, sat 3 large black trash bags and a taped cardboard box. I recognized them immediately. They were my emergency bags, the very same ones I had left neatly tucked inside the guest room closet just yesterday. Now they were sitting on the wet wooden floorboards, completely abandoned. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the storm. The cold rain soaked through my thin blouse instantly, but the chill on my skin was nothing compared to the freezing realization settling in my chest. I walked slowly up the concrete driveway, my shoes splashing in the puddles. I reached the porch and stared down at my belongings. The cheap black plastic of the trash bags glistened with rainwater. The cardboard box containing my important files and my children's winter clothes was already growing dark and soggy at the corners. I stepped up onto this porch, seeking refuge under the awning, but the wind whipped the rain sideways, soaking my hair and face. I raised my fist and knocked loudly on the heavy mahogany front door. I waited, shivering in the damp air. I knocked again, harder this time, demanding an answer. The brass deadbolt clicked loudly, echoing over the sound of the storm. The heavy door opened just a few inches, stopping abruptly as the security chain pulled tight. Through the narrow gap, I saw my mother Yvonne. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored cream-colored silk blouse and a matching skirt, looking as though she were ready for a high-society luncheon rather than a quiet afternoon at home. She did not unlatch the chain. She did not open the door any wider to let her soaking wet daughter step out of the storm. "Mom, open the door," I said, my voice steady despite the cold. "My bags are sitting out here in the rain. What is going on?" Yvonne crossed her arms over her chest, her face a mask of absolute rigid detachment. She looked past me, scanning the street to ensure none of her wealthy neighbors were watching this scene unfold. "Keep your voice down, Jasmine," she hissed through the crack in the door. "You cannot stay here. I packed your things this morning as soon as the court adjourned." I stared at her through the narrow opening, trying to comprehend the sheer callousness of her words. "You told me I could stay here until Monday," I reminded her, the rain dripping from my chin. "I just lost my house in front of a judge. I need a place to regroup for a few days." "Things have changed, Jasmine." Yvonne snapped, her eyes narrowing with cold calculation. "Harrison Caldwell called me 20 minutes after you walked out of that courtroom. He was furious about the entire ordeal. He also informed me that he is officially pledging $50,000 to the new youth wing at our church." I stood there, letting the freezing rain hit my back, fully understanding the transaction that had just occurred. "You are locking me out in a storm because Harrison Caldwell made a donation to the church building fund?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am not losing my seat on the senior deaconess board because my divorced daughter is sleeping on my couch," Yvonne fired back, her tone laced with self-righteous indignation. "Do you have any idea how much influence the Caldwell family has in this community? I cannot have people whispering that my daughter is a bitter failure who could not keep her husband from straying. Harrison made it very clear that any public support for you would be viewed as an insult to his family." "I have a reputation to maintain, Jasmine. Find a cheap motel. Just get off my porch before the neighbors start talking and asking questions." I looked at the woman who had brought me into this world. A woman who attended every Sunday service wearing a different designer hat, always preaching loudly about family values and Christian love. Behind that polished exterior was a soul completely corrupted by vanity and social climbing. I did not scream. I did not cry. The last remaining thread of familial loyalty I held for her snapped instantly, leaving behind nothing but cold, empty clarity. I reached down and grabbed the handles of 2 black trash bags, pulling them away from the wet cardboard box. "You chose a church pew over your own flesh and blood," I said, looking directly into her eyes. "Just like you chose to drain my entire college fund to bail out Dad's secret family 15 years ago. You stole my future back then, just so the congregation would not find out he had an illegitimate child. You have always preferred a comfortable, respectable lie over a difficult truth. Do not you dare bring up the past." Yvonne pointed a manicured finger at me through the gap in the door, her face turning red. "I did what I had to do to keep this family respectable. Something you clearly know nothing about. I would rather not have a daughter at all than let you drag my good name through the mud because you got dumped for a 25-year-old assistant." I picked up the soggy cardboard box, balancing it against my hip. "Enjoy your front row seat at church, Mom," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, devastating certainty. "Make sure you wear your absolute best hat. You are going to need it when the federal agents show up and the cameras start rolling." I did not wait for her to respond. I turned my back on her and walked down the steps, dragging the heavy bags through the pouring rain. I heard the door slam shut behind me, followed by the loud click of the deadbolt. I loaded the soaking wet bags and the damaged box into the trunk of my beat-up Honda Civic. I slid into the driver's seat, my clothes clinging uncomfortably to my skin, but the cold no longer bothered me. I turned the key in the ignition, and the old engine rumbled to life. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving my mother and Cascade Heights completely behind me. I drove back toward the city center, the rain gradually slowing as I entered Midtown Atlanta. The sprawling residential neighborhoods gave way to towering skyscrapers of glass and steel. I navigated the busy streets until I reached an exclusive, highly secure luxury high-rise building. I bypassed the main visitor entrance and drove down the side alley, approaching the private underground parking garage. I did not stop at the guard shack. Instead, I rolled down my window and held my thumb against the biometric scanner panel mounted on the concrete pillar. The scanner beeped, a pleasant green light flashing on the display. The massive reinforced steel gate rolled open smoothly, granting me access to the private residence parking. The security guard inside the booth gave me a respectful nod as I drove past. I pulled into my designated parking spot adjacent to a private elevator bay. This was the apartment I had quietly leased 3 months ago, using funds from a highly lucrative offshore forensic consulting contract that Terrence knew absolutely nothing about. The Caldwells and my mother thought they had cast me out into the street broke and desperate. They had no idea they had just pushed me directly into my fortress. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my midtown penthouse, illuminating the sleek, modern furniture and the spotless hardwood floors. My sanctuary was quiet, secure, and entirely my own. But my business with the Buckhead mansion was not quite finished. I still needed to retrieve the last of my children's belongings. Their custom-built bedroom furniture, their winter clothes, and the specific toys that brought them comfort. I drank a black coffee, gathered my moving boxes, and took the private elevator down to the garage. The drive back to the affluent neighborhood was a familiar route, but today it felt entirely different. I was no longer the dutiful wife returning to a gilded cage. I was the operative walking back into the blast zone to set the final charge. I parked my older model Honda Civic on the wide, circular driveway, right next to a brand-new, pristine white Mercedes G-Wagon that had a giant red bow tied to the grille. Terrence had clearly been busy spending the company capital. Before I even turned the knob on the heavy mahogany front door, I could hear the loud, obnoxious laughter echoing from the kitchen. I pushed the door open and stepped into the grand foyer. The marble floors gleamed under the crystal chandelier, and the smell of expensive citrus perfume hung thick in the air. There, standing around the massive quartz kitchen island, were Terrence, Sierra, and my former sister-in-law, Brooke. They were holding crystal flutes filled with golden champagne, celebrating what they believed was their ultimate victory. Sierra was wearing a silk robe that I recognized immediately. It was mine, a gift I had bought for myself in Paris 2 years ago. She leaned against Terence, sipping her drink with a look of supreme satisfaction. Brooke stood across from them, her blonde hair perfectly styled, raising her glass in a toast. To new beginnings, Brooke chimed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. And to a house that finally has the right kind of energy. No more spreadsheets and tension ruining the vibe. Terence chuckled, wrapping his arm around Sierra's waist. I will drink to that. It is amazing how much lighter the air feels when you remove the dead weight from the property. I walked into the kitchen, my footsteps echoing sharply against the marble tile. The laughter died instantly. Terence stiffened, his smile turning into a hostile sneer. Brooke took a quick step back, nearly spilling her champagne, while Sierra simply tightened her grip on my silk robe. What are you doing here, Jasmine? Terence demanded, setting his glass down hard on the court's counter. The court order was finalized yesterday. You have absolutely no legal right to step foot on this property without my express written permission. I am here for the last of my children's belongings, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. I am taking their winter clothes, their personal toys, and the custom bedroom furniture I commissioned for them last year. I have a moving truck waiting down the street. It will take less than an hour. Sierra stepped away from Terence, blocking the hallway that led to the bedrooms. She crossed her arms, resting them defensively over her pregnant belly, her eyes narrowed with greedy entitlement. You are not taking a single thing out of those rooms, Jasmine. Terence explicitly said that everything inside this house belongs to me now. That includes the custom furniture. I looked at her, taking in the sheer audacity of a woman wearing my clothes and claiming my children's beds. Sierra, those beds were custom built for my son and daughter, I explained calmly. They have their names carved into the headboards. What possible use could you have for them? I am going to have the names sanded off and repainted. Sierra shot back, a cruel, victorious smile spreading across her face. They are high-end solid wood pieces. I am keeping them for my own nursery. Besides, you waived all rights to the marital assets. You signed the papers. You do not get to come back here and cherry-pick the expensive items just because you are moving into some cramped little apartment. Leave it all. Brooke stepped forward, offering her signature brand of condescending pity. She really is right, Jasmine. You have to let go. Clinging to the furniture is just a sad attempt to maintain a connection to a lifestyle you no longer possess. It is time to accept your new reality and move on gracefully. I looked at Brooke, then at Terence, who was watching the exchange with a deeply satisfied smirk. He was enjoying this. He loved seeing the women in his life put me down. He thought I was standing there feeling humiliated and powerless. He had absolutely no idea that Sierra had just handed me the perfect opening. You know what, Sierra? You are completely right, I said, offering a smooth, compliant nod. I did sign the papers. I waived my rights to the physical assets. The house and everything inside it officially belongs to you and Terence now. You can keep the custom beds. You can keep the winter coats. You can keep the silk robe you are currently stretching out. Sierra puffed out her chest, looking incredibly pleased with herself. I knew you would eventually see reason. Now get out before we call the police for trespassing. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out a heavy antique brass key. The metal was cold against my palm. I held it up, letting it catch the light from the chandelier overhead. I tossed the key casually onto the quartz kitchen island. It landed with a loud, sharp clatter, sliding to a stop right next to Sierra's champagne flute. Just one last detail before I leave, I said, my voice dropping to a serious professional tone. I left the basement safe locked, the large biometric one hidden behind the wine cellar paneling. Terence frowned, staring at the key. What are you talking about? I did not ask for the safe combination. I know you did not, Terence, I replied, turning my attention back to Sierra. But since Sierra here was so incredibly adamant about taking complete ownership of every single thing inside this house, she needs to understand her new responsibilities. Inside that safe are your private tax ledgers, the physical encryption tokens for the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the hard drives containing the original loan applications for the business. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool quartz counter, making sure Sierra was listening to every single word. The federal government has very specific rules regarding the chain of custody for financial records. Since you proudly demanded 100% liability and ownership of this property, Sierra, that includes the contents of the hidden safe. You own the house, so you own the safe. Guard that key with your life, Sierra. Your entire future literally depends on what is inside that metal box. Sierra's eyes widened not with fear but with unadulterated greed. She did not hear the words federal government or liability. All she heard was offshore accounts and hidden safes. She looked at the brass key like it was a solid bar of gold. She immediately reached out and snatched the key off the counter, clutching it tightly in her fist. "Do not worry about my house, Jasmine," Sierra sneered, slipping the key into the pocket of the silk robe. "I will guard it perfectly. Now take your empty boxes and get off my property." I stood up straight, offering them one final polite smile. I turned my back on the three of them and walked out the front door. The humid Atlanta air hit me again, but this time it felt like pure oxygen. I walked down the driveway toward my car, my heart beating a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. Sierra thought she had just secured the keys to a hidden treasure trove. Brooke thought she had just witnessed the final humiliating defeat of a woman she despised. Terrence thought he had completely outsmarted his boring accountant wife. None of them realized what had actually just happened in that kitchen. I opened my car door and slid into the driver's seat. I had not just abandoned my children's furniture. I had just legally and verbally established in front of 3 witnesses that Sierra Caldwell knowingly and willingly accepted physical possession of the primary evidence linking their names to a $12 million federal fraud scheme. I had handed her the murder weapon, and she had proudly polished it with her own fingerprints. I started the engine, pulled out of the driveway, and drove away, leaving them to drink their champagne, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb sitting right inside their pocket. The next morning, I sat at the sleek glass dining table in my new penthouse apartment, overlooking the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I had sent my resume to 3 of the top-tier accounting firms in the city the night before. My professional record was flawless, and my success rate in corporate auditing was unmatched. Yet by noon, I received 3 identical email rejections. They were not standard automated replies. They were personalized messages from senior partners stating that due to unfortunate conflicts of interest, they could not offer me a position at this time. I knew exactly what that meant. Harrison Caldwell had been very busy. He was using his massive network and influential board memberships to completely blacklist me from the local financial sector. He wanted to drain my resources and force me into absolute submission. He expected me to panic. He expected me to realize that I could not survive in this city without the Caldwell family name protecting me. He wanted me to crawl back to his office and beg for a meager child support check, just to keep a roof over my children's heads. I closed my laptop, taking a slow sip of my black coffee. Harrison had no idea that I did not need his permission or his connections to work. My offshore forensic consulting business was completely anonymous and heavily encrypted. I had more than enough capital to sustain myself and my children for years without ever stepping foot in a traditional office. But his aggressive attempt to starve me out was a clear sign that the Caldwells were starting to feel the pressure of my departure. They needed to control me to feel secure. My phone vibrated against the glass table. The screen displayed the name Jamal, my brother-in-law, the supposedly reasonable Caldwell brother who always played the diplomatic peacemaker when it suited his own financial interests. He was the soft face of a very ruthless family. I let the phone vibrate 3 times before picking it up and placing it to my ear. "Jasmine," Jamal said, his voice practically dripping with forced sympathy. "I am so glad you answered the phone. I have been really worried about you." I remained completely silent, letting him fill the dead air. I knew how much he hated silence. "Look," Jamal continued, his tone shifting to that of a disappointed but caring older brother, Things have gotten way out of hand, Jasmine. Dad is furious and Terrence is completely stressed out with the new company transition. You are making this much harder than it needs to be. Getting yourself blacklisted from the best firms around town is just hurting my niece and nephew. You have to think about the kids. I did not get myself blacklisted, Jamal, I said, my voice perfectly calm. Your father made those calls because he wants to see me break. Jamal let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh. Dad is just protecting the family image, Jasmine. You embarrassed Terrence in court, and you were incredibly rude to Sierra yesterday when you dropped off the keys. But we can fix this. I talked to Dad and Terrence this morning. I can smooth things over for you and make all of this go away. I waited, listening to the trap being set. Just apologize to Dad and Terrence. Jamal said, his voice dropping into a persuasive rhythm. Let Terrence have the kids on weekends for photo ops. He has new investors coming in, and it will look really good if he appears to be a dedicated family man navigating a tough situation. Do not be the angry, bitter black woman, Jasmine. You know exactly how that looks in our circles. People are already talking. Just swallow your pride, play the game, and the family will make sure you do not starve. I looked out the large windows, watching the tiny cars move along the interstate far below. Jamal actually thought he was throwing me a lifeline. He thought asking me to rent out my children to repair his cheating brother's public image was a generous compromise. He wanted me to smile and perform for the very men who were actively trying to destroy my life. I let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed in my empty apartment. It was not a bitter laugh or an angry laugh. It was the sound of complete, absolute amusement. What is so funny? Jamal demanded, his friendly facade cracking instantly. I am trying to help you, Jasmine. You have absolutely nothing right now. You are completely cut off from the money. I appreciate the call, Jamal, I said, leaning back in my chair. You always did excel at playing the good guy while twisting the knife. But I do not need a quiet job, and I am definitely not apologizing to men who build their entire empires on arrogance and fraud. You have lost your mind. Jamal snapped, his voice turning vicious. You are a divorced, unemployed accountant. You cannot fight Dad. I smiled, looking at the encrypted federal portal still open on my laptop screen. Tell Harrison to check the title of his flagship commercial building down in Midtown, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. The massive glass tower he proudly used as collateral to secure the Small Business Administration loan for the startup Terrence built. There was dead silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Jamal breathing heavily, trying to process what I had just said. Tell him to run a deep public records search this afternoon, I continued smoothly. It is incredibly funny how fast federal tax liens get filed when the government realizes millions in stolen relief funds are sitting in an offshore account. Enjoy your weekend, Jamal. I ended the call before he could formulate a single response. I placed the phone face down on the table. The Caldwells thought they were cutting off my oxygen. They had no idea they were already suffocating. I walked away from the glass dining table and moved into the second bedroom, which I had converted into a dedicated server room and office. The walls were lined with soundproofing panels, and 3 massive curved monitors sat on a heavy standing desk. This was my actual domain. The Caldwells thought I was some glorified bookkeeper who just balanced their household budgets. They never understood that forensic accounting is not about addition and subtraction. It is about tracing shadows. It is about finding the exact point where a lie becomes a digital footprint. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and woke the screens from sleep mode. My proprietary tracking software booted up, displaying a complex web of interconnected nodes. Each node represented a bank account, a shell company, or a supposedly anonymous offshore trust. I pulled up the primary Caldwell Innovations corporate ledger and initiated a cross-reference protocol with federal loan disbursement records. The screen blinked rapidly as the software ingested the data, pulling from the exact files Sierra was currently guarding in her basement safe. I watched the flow of money light up in bright red lines across my monitors. It was almost insulting how sloppy Terrence had been. He possessed the arrogance of a man who had never faced a single consequence in his life. I traced a $5 million deposit from the Federal Paycheck Protection Program. The funds were originally requested to keep non-existent employees on a phantom payroll. Instead, I watched the red line bounce from the corporate account to a holding company in Delaware, and then split into two distinct streams. The first stream funneled directly into Terrence's personal offshore account. A quick matching of dates and routing numbers confirmed exactly where that money went. 3 days after the federal transfer cleared, Terrence purchased the pristine white Mercedes G-Wagon that was currently sitting in the Buckhead driveway, the one with the giant red bow. He bought his mistress a luxury vehicle using stolen government relief funds. I moved my cursor to the second stream of money. This one was far larger and much more heavily disguised. It bounced through 3 different limited liability corporations before landing in a private trust controlled entirely by Harrison Caldwell. The documentation showed a maritime purchase order. Harrison had used $2.5 million of fraudulent Small Business Administration loans to buy a luxury yacht registered in the Bahamas. They were practically begging to be indicted. As I was linking the yacht registration to Harrison's personal tax identification number, a sharp, high-pitched chime echoed through the silent apartment. My secondary monitor flashed with a sudden, stark yellow warning banner. Unauthorized network access attempt detected. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second, my hands hovering over the keyboard. I glanced at the network security dashboard I had custom-built for this exact apartment. Someone was actively trying to breach my encrypted Wi-Fi network. They were attempting a brute force attack to slip past my firewall and view my local traffic. Harrison had not just made phone calls to blacklist me. He had hired a private investigator to track me down and hack into my digital life. He wanted to know exactly what I was doing and who I was talking to. I cracked my knuckles, feeling a slow, dark smile spread across my face. Harrison was playing checkers while I was designing the board. I bypassed my own firewall and created a tiny, deliberate vulnerability. A digital cracked window. The intruder took the bait, instantly pushing their connection through the narrow gap. The moment they entered my secure subnet, I slammed the digital door shut, trapping their IP address inside a quarantined sandbox environment. My fingers flew across the keys, running a rapid traceroute on their connection. The software peeled back their masked location servers one by one, bouncing from a fake node in Eastern Europe back to a local server in downtown Atlanta. In less than 40 seconds, I had the exact physical location of the device attempting the hack. It was an office building registered to a private security firm known to be on the Caldwell payroll. I did not just block their access, I decided to send a message. I accessed a secure anonymous messaging relay protocol and routed it directly through the investigator's trapped connection, bypassing his security to reach his primary client. I entered the private cell phone number for Harrison Caldwell, the same number he only gave to high-level politicians and elite business partners. I typed a single text message, "Watching you." I hit send. I immediately wiped the connection, severed the external node, and fortified the firewall, making my network completely dark and invisible again. I could imagine Harrison sitting in his leather office chair, his private, untraceable phone vibrating with a message from an absolute ghost. The paranoia would eat him alive. I turned my attention back to the primary monitor, ready to finalize the evidence packaging, when a new notification quietly slid onto the top right corner of my screen. It was not an alert or a system warning. It was a single encrypted email routed through the secure portal I had established days ago. I clicked on the notification. The message decrypted line by line, revealing the official seal of the Department of the Treasury. The email was brief, formal, and devastatingly clear. The Internal Revenue Service whistleblower office had officially reviewed the preliminary files I had submitted from the courthouse parking lot. The message stated that due to the sheer volume and credibility of the evidence, a senior special agent from the Criminal Investigation Division had been permanently assigned to my case. A secure face-to-face meeting was requested within 48 hours to initiate formal federal proceedings. I read the name of the special agent at the bottom of the screen. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cool air of the apartment wash over me. The forensic web was completely woven. The bait had been taken. The federal government was now actively engaged. The trap I had spent months meticulously building was officially armed and waiting for the Caldwells to take one final arrogant step. 48 hours after the email from the federal agent, my phone rang. It was late Saturday afternoon, the exact time Terrence was legally mandated to return my children. I answered expecting to hear my son or daughter. Instead, Terrence spoke with that familiar arrogant drawl. He told me he was simply too busy with company business to make the drive across town. He said if I wanted to see my kids this weekend, I would have to come get them myself. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to force me back to the Buckhead mansion. He wanted me to witness his ultimate triumph. I drove my older model car toward the gated community, feeling a strange sense of calm. When I pulled up to the familiar street, I was met with a long line of luxury vehicles. A professional valet service had set up a staging area at the end of the wide circular driveway. Terrence was not just having a quiet evening at home. He was throwing a massive housewarming and startup funding gala right in the middle of a federal investigation. He was burning through the stolen government capital as fast as he could. I could see massive custom ice sculptures glittering on the front lawn under the landscape lights. The entire production must have cost at least $100,000. I parked 3 blocks away and walked toward the glowing estate. The heavy mahogany front doors were wide open, spilling loud music and the chatter of Atlanta elite into the humid evening air. I walked up the grand stone steps and stepped into the foyer. The house was completely transformed. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms carried silver trays of expensive caviar and crystal flutes of champagne. A live jazz quartet played softly on the back terrace. I scanned the crowded room looking for my children. They were nowhere to be found, likely shoved into a back bedroom with a hired nanny so they would not ruin the aesthetic of the evening. Instead, my eyes locked onto a sight that made my blood run entirely cold. Standing by the massive marble fireplace holding a glass of red wine was my own mother, Yvonne. She was wearing a brand new designer dress and laughing loudly at something Harrison Caldwell had just said. She was supposed to be my support system. Instead, she was happily schmoozing with the man actively trying to destroy my life. Yvonne had always worshipped wealth and status above all else. She clearly decided that staying in the good graces of the Caldwell family was much more important than showing any loyalty to her discarded daughter. Harrison tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the loud music, and the jazz quartet immediately stopped playing. The entire room of wealthy investors, socialites, and family members fell completely silent, turning their attention to the patriarch of the Caldwell empire. Harrison stood on the bottom step of the grand staircase, projecting his voice so every single person could hear his victory speech. "I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate this incredible milestone," Harrison announced, beaming with false humility. "We are here tonight to honor new beginnings and the unstoppable future of Caldwell Innovations." He gestured grandly toward Terrence, who was standing next to Sierra. Sierra was wearing another one of my dresses, her hand resting proudly on the arm of Terrence. "My son Terrence has faced significant personal challenges this year," Harrison continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "But he handled them like a true Caldwell. He finally shed the dead weight that was holding him back. He cleared the negative energy from his life and his home. And because of his sheer brilliance, he is taking this company to a $50 million valuation by the end of the fourth quarter." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. People raised their crystal glasses, cheering for the man who had stolen millions and abandoned his family. I looked through the sea of clapping hands and saw my mother. Yvonne was clapping the loudest, her face glowing with absolute pride for the men who were actively trying to starve her only daughter. She raised her glass to Harrison, offering him a wide, supportive smile. They all thought I was just a defeated woman standing in the shadows watching them win. They thought they had completely erased me from the narrative. I did not turn around and leave. I did not shrink away in tears. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on Harrison and started walking forward. The crowd naturally parted as I moved through the room, my flat shoes making no sound against the hardwood floors. I walked straight past my mother, ignoring her sudden gasp of shock. I walked past Sierra, who instinctively took a step backward, clutching her pregnant belly. I walked right up the bottom step of the grand staircase. Before Harrison could even lower his glass or utter another word, I reached out and took the microphone directly from his hand. The heavy metal of the microphone felt cold in my hand. I turned to face the sea of wealthy guests, my voice amplifying across the grand foyer. "Congratulations, Terrence," I said, letting the words ring out through the high ceiling. "A $50 million valuation is incredibly impressive. It is almost as impressive as securing $10 million in federal minority business grants for a revolutionary tech product that does not actually exist." The live music had completely stopped. The entire room went dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Investors in custom suits exchanged nervous glances, holding their champagne flutes mid-air. Harrison stood frozen next to me, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Terrence took an aggressive step forward, his jaw clenched in absolute fury, but Sierra yanked his arm, pulling him back. She looked terrified, suddenly remembering the brass key I had left on her kitchen counter just a few days ago. My mother Yvonne covered her mouth with her hand, looking around the room as if trying to find a hole to crawl into. She was clearly more horrified by my public breach of etiquette than the actual words I had just spoken. Before Harrison could signal the private security guard standing near the front doors, Brooke pushed her way through the crowd of stunned guests. She marched right up to the base of the staircase, her blonde hair bouncing, her posture rigid with that familiar, entitled authority she always carried. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe disapproval, perfectly playing the role of the civilized peacemaker, stepping in to handle the unruly and angry woman. "Jasmine, your tone is completely inappropriate," Brooke said, projecting her voice so the surrounding guests could hear exactly how reasonable and calm she sounded. "You are clearly very emotional right now, and you are making everyone incredibly uncomfortable. Security needs to escort you out immediately. You are scaring the investors and ruining a beautiful evening for this family. You really need to go home and seek professional help for this outburst." I did not hand the microphone back. I did not step down from the stairs. I simply looked down at Brooke, taking in her condescending smile and her expensive designer gown. She truly believed she was untouchable. She believed her marriage to Jamal shielded her from the Caldwell family corruption. She thought she was just an innocent, wealthy bystander, graciously stepping in to calm a hysterical ex-wife. I adjusted my grip on the microphone, looking directly into Brooke's eyes. "Are those the same investors you are so worried about scaring, Brooke?" I asked, my voice echoing loud and perfectly clear across the silent mansion. "Are you talking about the anonymous investors from the massive shell company located down in the Cayman Islands?" Brooke stiffened, her condescending smile freezing instantly on her face. She blinked, looking quickly over her shoulder at Jamal, who was standing near the back of the room, suddenly looking very pale and completely terrified. "Because I traced that specific offshore account this morning, I continued making sure every single person in the room heard every single word. The one holding all the embezzled federal funds. The exact same offshore account that Jamal set up 3 months ago using your maiden name, Brooke." The color drained completely from Brooke's face. Her eyes went wide with pure, unfiltered panic. Her fingers went entirely slack. The expensive crystal champagne glass slipped right from her hand and crashed onto the hard marble floor. The sharp sound of shattering glass echoed through the silent mansion like a gunshot. Before the last piece of glass even settled on the marble floor, rough hands clamped down hard on both of my arms. Terrence grabbed my left bicep and Harrison grabbed my right. Their grips were bruising and desperate. They shoved me forward, forcing me away from the grand staircase and pulling me down the long corridor toward the back of the house. The remaining guests murmured in shock as the patriarch and the golden son manhandled me out of the foyer. They pushed through the heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The waitstaff took one look at Harrison's furious face and immediately scrambled out the back exit, leaving us completely alone in the massive stainless steel room. Terrence shoved me hard against the granite prep island. I stumbled slightly, but immediately locked my knees and stood up perfectly straight. The kitchen doors swung open again and my mother rushed in. Yvonne was completely hysterical. Her chest heaved and her carefully styled hair was coming undone. She marched right up to me, her face twisted with a mixture of terror and absolute rage. "Are you trying to ruin me?" Yvonne screamed, slapping her hands against the granite counter. "The pastor from our church is out there, Jasmine. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? You march in here and humiliate this family in front of half the congregation and the most important people in Atlanta. You are a spiteful, jealous woman, and you are destroying your own life just to hurt Terrence." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me feeling absolutely nothing. She cared more about the opinion of a pastor than the fact that her daughter was being physically assaulted by two corrupt men. I did not even get a chance to respond before Harrison stepped directly into my personal space. His face was purple with rage and the veins in his neck were visibly bulging. He raised his right hand, pulling it back as if he was going to strike me right across the face. My mother gasped, but she did not step between us. She just covered her mouth and watched. "I will crush you!" Harrison snarled, his hand still suspended in the air. "I will completely destroy your life, Jasmine. You think you can walk into my house and threaten my empire with your pathetic little accounting tricks? I own this city. I own the people who run this city. I will make sure you are so thoroughly blacklisted that you cannot get a job flipping burgers in this state. You will be homeless and begging on the street before I am done with you." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I stared right into his furious eyes and held my ground. He was used to women cowering when he raised his voice and his fists. He was waiting for me to apologize and beg for mercy. He slowly lowered his hand, realizing that physical intimidation was not going to work on a woman who had already dismantled his financial safety net. I turned my attention away from Harrison and looked directly at Terrence. He was standing near the industrial refrigerator, breathing heavily and trying to look imposing. He had no idea the ground beneath him had already collapsed. I stepped away from the counter and walked slowly toward Terrence, closing the distance until I was standing just inches from his chest. He tried to maintain his arrogant stare, but I could see the tiny bead of sweat rolling down his temple. "Did Sierra open the basement safe yet?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and conversational. Terrence swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Harrison and then back to me. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "Because you really need to brush up on federal tax law, Terrence." I continued, casually adjusting the cuff of my sleeve. "The Internal Revenue Service has very strict mandates regarding criminal conspiracy. Whoever holds the physical encryption keys to fraudulent offshore accounts is legally designated as a primary conspirator. When you put all those ledgers and security tokens in that biometric safe and handed Sierra complete ownership of the house, you gave her possession of the evidence. She is now holding the bag for $10 million in stolen federal grants." Terrence went absolutely pale. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly shade of gray. His arrogant posture crumbled instantly. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the stainless steel sink. I watched him slowly turn his head to look out the large kitchen window that faced the back terrace. Out on the patio, the party was still trying to recover from my grand entrance. Sierra was standing near the edge of the illuminated pool. She was happily chatting with the exact same group of Cayman Island investors that Brooke had just exposed. Around her neck was a massive diamond necklace catching the light from the outdoor chandeliers. It was a necklace Terrence had purchased just last week using the stolen relief funds. Terrence stared through the glass, watching his pregnant mistress, proudly wearing the physical evidence of federal fraud while mingling with men who were about to be indicted. He realized in that exact moment that he had not just ruined his own life. He had handed the mother of his unborn child a one-way ticket to federal prison. I watched the exact moment the truth finally registered in Terrence's eyes. He looked physically sick, completely paralyzed by the reality of what he had done to the woman carrying his child. I did not say another word to him. I simply stepped back from the granite counter and walked out of the catering kitchen, leaving my mother and Harrison standing in absolute stunned silence. I walked up the grand staircase, ignoring the confused stares of the remaining guests who were still whispering about Brooke's offshore accounts. I went straight to the second-floor guest wing and found my son and daughter sitting on a plush rug playing a board game with a very bored teenage nanny. I grabbed their small hands and told them it was time to go home. We walked down the wide stairs together. The atmosphere in the massive foyer was incredibly thick with tension. Terrence had emerged from the kitchen behind me and was desperately trying to perform damage control. He needed to prove to the lingering investors that he was still the wealthy, powerful man they all believed him to be. He saw me walking toward the front door and decided to make one final grand theatrical gesture to reassert his absolute dominance. He loudly called the elite catering manager over to the center of the marble room. He announced to the remaining crowd that he wanted to settle the $30,000 catering bill plus a massive tip right then and there, just to show his appreciation for their hard work. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his heavy metal black American Express card. He handed it to the manager with a smug, arrogant smile, looking directly at me to make sure I was watching him flex his financial power. The catering manager swiped the heavy black card through his wireless payment terminal. The machine processed for a brief second before emitting a sharp, loud red beep. Declined. Terrence snatched the card back, his face immediately flushing a deep, angry red. He muttered something loudly about an automatic fraud alert triggering on such large weekend purchases. He pulled a different platinum credit card from his designer wallet and swiped it through the machine himself. Another loud, harsh beep echoed through the uncomfortably quiet room. Declined. Harrison pushed his way forward, looking utterly humiliated by his son's public financial failure. He aggressively pulled out his own elite corporate black card and shoved it directly into the catering manager's hand. He angrily commanded the man to run the card for $50,000 and keep the change for the inconvenience. The manager slowly inserted the chip into the terminal while the entire room watched in dead silence. The machine thought for a few long seconds before letting out the exact same sharp red beep. Declined. Harrison stared at the little machine in absolute disbelief. He demanded that the manager run the card again, claiming the terminal had to be broken or suffering from a network error. The catering manager looked down at the digital screen, his brow heavily furrowed in confusion. He looked up at Harrison and Terrence, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent ballroom. "Sir, the bank code does not say insufficient funds or network error. It says account frozen, federal mandate." Furious and panicked whispers instantly erupted across the entire room. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were suddenly looking at the Caldwell men as if they were highly contagious. I stood by the massive front doors, holding my children's hands tightly. I watched with quiet satisfaction as the wealthy Cayman Island investors quietly set down their expensive crystal champagne flutes and started slipping out the front doors right past me, disappearing quickly into the dark, humid Atlanta night. I drove away from the Buckhead estate with my children safely secured in the back seat, leaving the Caldwell family to drown in the chaos I had orchestrated. I did not look in the rearview mirror. The drive back to my modest apartment was incredibly peaceful. My kids were exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately. I carried them inside and tucked them into their beds, kissing their foreheads. They were finally completely removed from the toxic environment of that mansion. They were safe, and they were mine. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat at my desk in the second bedroom watching the digital dashboard on my 3 massive curved monitors. I watched as the federal holds rippled through the Caldwell corporate infrastructure. It was beautiful to watch the red alerts pop up one by one across the offshore accounts, the domestic holding companies, and the shadow trusts. The Department of the Treasury moved with terrifying speed once they had the exact decryption keys. By the time the sky outside my window began to turn a faint shade of morning gray, I knew the financial freeze was absolute. The Caldwell empire was officially starved of capital. At exactly 6 in the morning, the quiet peace of my apartment was shattered by violent pounding on my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate, aggressive hammering of men who were watching their entire universe collapse around them. I did not rush. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the espresso machine. I listened to the frantic pounding echo down the hallway while the rich, dark coffee dripped into my small ceramic cup. They had made me wait for years. They could wait another 2 minutes. I tightened the belt of my emerald green silk robe and picked up my espresso. I walked slowly to the front door, checking the security camera feed on my phone. Harrison and Terrence stood in the hallway looking like absolute wrecks. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The polished, arrogant men from the gala were completely gone. Terrence was still wearing his expensive suit pants and dress shirt from the night before, but the fabric was heavily wrinkled and soaked with nervous sweat. His tie was missing, and his collar was unbuttoned. His eyes were bloodshot and darting frantically around the hallway. Harrison looked even worse. His usual intimidating posture was replaced by a rigid, shaking rage. His face was pale, and the deep lines around his mouth looked carved from stone. "What did you do to our accounts?" Terrence screamed the moment the door swung open. His voice was hoarse and cracking with pure panic. He tried to push his way past me into the apartment, but I stood firmly in the doorway, blocking his path. "We have spent the entire night on the phone with our offshore managers and domestic bankers." Terrence continued, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "Every single line of credit is locked. The corporate cards are dead. The payroll accounts are seized. Even my personal checking account is showing a zero balance. They are telling me there is a federal hold on everything we own. Tell me exactly what you did, Jasmine." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, letting the hot, bitter coffee warm my throat. I looked at my ex-husband, watching him tremble. He was no longer the golden boy of Atlanta. He was just a terrified thief realizing he had finally been caught. He thought he could outsmart the federal government just because he had a famous last name. "I did not do anything, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and level. That is the beautiful thing about forensic accounting. It is not about sabotage or manipulation or stealing. It is simply about following the digital paper trail that you were too arrogant to hide. Terrence stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I explained how the federal banking algorithms work. They are designed to look for very specific patterns of fraud. I told him that an algorithm simply flagged a massive, glaring discrepancy between his Small Business Administration loan application and the sudden $200,000 wire transfer sent directly to a luxury car dealership. The exact same dealership where he bought the pristine white vehicle for his mistress. The funds were supposed to save minority-owned businesses and keep struggling employees on a payroll. Instead, the money went straight to buying a custom interior for Sierra. I just made sure the algorithm looked in the exact right place, I added, offering him a cold, tight smile. Terrence looked like he was going to be physically sick right there in the hallway. He stumbled backward, leaning against the painted wall and burying his face in his trembling hands. He finally understood the magnitude of his stupidity. He had handed a forensic accountant the exact blueprint of his crimes and expected me to just walk away quietly. He had thought I was weak. He was wrong. Harrison stepped forward, aggressively pushing his son aside. He tried to summon his old terrifying authority. He puffed out his chest and glared down at me, his face turning a deep shade of purple with absolute fury. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you have won?" Harrison snarled, his voice dropping to a vicious, dangerous whisper. "You think some automatic freeze is going to take down Caldwell Innovations? You are nothing but a bitter ex-wife playing games you do not understand. I have powerful politicians in my pocket, Jasmine. I have state senators and federal judges who eat dinner at my table and accept my campaign contributions." He leaned closer, trying to use his physical presence to force me to back down. He was trying to cast a shadow over me, but I refused to stand in the dark any longer. "A bank freeze is entirely temporary." Harrison continued, spitting the words at me. "I will make a few phone calls this morning and have this entire misunderstanding cleared up, and then I am coming for you. I will have you sitting in a county jail cell for corporate sabotage and cybercrimes before noon. I will make sure you never see those children again. You are going to pay for this." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground and looked at the patriarch of the Caldwell family, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of victory. He was still playing by the old rules. He still thought he could buy his way out of federal prosecution. He still thought his money and his name made him completely invincible. He did not realize that the evidence was already completely out of his control. The federal government did not care about his dinner parties or his campaign contributions. I took another slow sip of my espresso, feeling the rich caffeine buzz in my veins. I let a genuine, satisfied smile spread across my face. I looked directly into Harrison's furious, desperate eyes, watching the last remnants of his empire crumble. "You better check the news, Harrison," I said softly. "You better check the news, Harrison," I said softly. Harrison pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Terrence leaned over his father's shoulder, staring at the bright screen. I watched the remaining blood drain from their faces as they read the breaking headlines. Federal agents were actively raiding the Caldwell corporate headquarters downtown. News helicopters were broadcasting live footage of agents carrying boxes of hard drives and physical ledgers out of their pristine glass building. Harrison could not even speak. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He turned around and walked down the hallway like a dead man shuffling toward the elevators. Terrence followed right behind him, looking back at me one last time with wide, terrified eyes before I quietly closed my front door and locked the deadbolt. I walked back into my kitchen and poured the rest of my espresso into the sink. The morning sun was completely up now, filling my small apartment with bright, clean light. I walked down the hall and peeked into the bedroom. My children were still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the absolute devastation I had just unleashed upon the people who thought they could destroy us. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settling over my entire body. The Caldwell Empire was falling in real time, and I did not have to lift another finger to push it over the edge. Or so I thought. My cell phone started vibrating loudly on the granite counter. The screen lit up, casting a harsh glow across the kitchen. The caller ID flashed a frantic incoming call from Brooke. I let it ring 3 times before I finally walked over and picked it up, pressing the cold glass to my ear. I did not even get a chance to say a simple hello before the screaming started. Brooke was completely hysterical. Her voice was shrill and cracking with pure panic. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe. The federal agents had just shown up at her massive suburban estate. She sobbed that they were currently tearing through her home office, seizing Jamal's computers, and subpoenaing all of his private business records. Her perfect polite facade was completely gone. She was no longer the composed, wealthy woman offering me unsolicited advice and fake sympathy at dinner parties. She was a cornered animal realizing her entire fabricated life was over. "You ruined my family!" Brooke screamed through the phone, her voice turning absolutely vicious and hateful. "You ghetto trash. You vindictive, jealous loser. You could not handle the fact that Terrence moved on to someone better, so you had to destroy all of us. I am going to sue you for everything you have, Jasmine. I am going to take your children away. I am going to make sure you rot in a prison cell for hacking our accounts." I listened to her unhinged rant, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. She was exactly the person I always knew she was beneath the designer clothes and the expensive charity galas. She was ugly and greedy and completely devoid of morals. I waited until she had to stop screaming just to take a breath. "I did not hack anything, Brooke," I said calmly, walking over to my kitchen window to look out at the quiet street below. "You signed the Cayman Island documents yourself. You were the managing director of that offshore shell company. You wanted to be a part of the Caldwell wealth so badly that you never even bothered to ask where the millions of dollars were actually coming from. You just wanted the new luxury cars and the exclusive country club memberships. You sold your soul for a lifestyle you could not afford, and you put your own signature on the federal fraud documents to get it." I heard Brooke sobbing uncontrollably on the other end of the line. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air, as the reality of her legal situation finally crushed her. I leaned against the window frame and smiled, watching a neighbor walk their dog down the peaceful sidewalk. "I highly suggest you start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney, Brooke." I continued, my voice perfectly level. "Enjoy federal prison. I hear orange is really not your color." There was a loud, violent scrambling sound on the other end of the line. Someone was physically wresting the phone away from Brooke. I could hear her crying and shrieking in the background as a deep, panicked voice came over the speaker. It was Jamal. He sounded absolutely terrified. He was breathing heavily and his words were running together in a desperate, frantic rush. "Jasmine, please, you have to help us," Jamal begged. He was practically crying himself, his voice shaking with absolute terror. "The federal agents are taking everything. They have the physical ledgers from the Caymans. They have the wire transfers Brooke signed. You are the only one who understands the routing architecture. You built these financial tracking systems. You know how to access the back end of the servers." I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear. I looked down at the bright screen. Jamal was actively asking me to participate in a federal cover-up. He was begging me to commit a massive cybercrime to hide their stolen government money. I did not say a single word. I simply reached out with my thumb and pressed the bright red record button on my call screen. I put the phone back to my ear, listening to the digital timer ticking away as it captured every single word of his desperate criminal conspiracy. "Please, Jasmine," Jamal sobbed through the speaker, his voice echoing in my quiet kitchen. "Just tell me how to wipe the servers. Tell me how to scramble the IP addresses before they access the main database. I will give you anything you want. I will transfer $1 million to a clean account for your kids right now. Just tell me how to hide the paper trail." I let Jamal keep talking. I stood in my quiet kitchen and listened to him spell out exactly how he wanted to launder the remaining money and exactly how much he was willing to pay me to help him evade federal prosecution. He was offering me millions of dollars in clean, untraceable funds if I just logged into the servers and erased his digital footprint. I let him cry and beg for a full 5 minutes, ensuring the recording captured every single desperate admission of guilt. When he finally ran out of breath, I simply pressed the end call button. I saved the audio file to my encrypted cloud drive and forwarded a copy directly to the lead investigator at the Internal Revenue Service. I did not even have time to set my phone down before the screen lit up with an automated security alert from my children's private elementary school. It was an early dismissal notification stating that an authorized family member was attempting to sign them out of class. I had explicitly removed Terrence and Harrison from the approved pickup list the morning I filed for divorce, but my mother was technically still on the emergency contact sheet. I realized immediately what was happening. They were trying to take my kids to use as leverage against me. I grabbed my car keys and ran out the door. The drive to the school took less than 10 minutes, but my heart was pounding the entire time. I pulled into the visitor parking lot and saw my mother's silver Lexus idling near the front entrance. Yvonne was standing by the reception desk, aggressively arguing with the administrative assistant. I walked through the double glass doors just as the receptionist was explaining that she needed to verify the early dismissal with me first. I stepped right between my mother and the front desk. I told the receptionist that everything was fine and that my children would be staying in class for the rest of the afternoon. Yvonne grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into my skin. She did not say a word inside the building, but she dragged me out of the main office and into the sunny parking lot. The moment we were far enough away from the building, her polite Southern society mask completely vanished. She looked frantic and utterly exhausted. Her carefully styled hair was messy, and her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask how her grandchildren were coping with the sudden divorce. She went straight to the only thing that actually mattered to her. "Harrison withdrew his entire annual church donation this morning," Yvonne cried out, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "He canceled the massive check for the new community center. The pastor is absolutely furious with me, Jasmine. He called me into his private office and demanded an explanation. The entire congregation is talking about it. You have to fix this right now." I stared at my mother, feeling a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. She was standing in a school parking lot trying to kidnap my innocent children to use as bargaining chips just to save her social standing at a church. "I just got off the phone with Terrence." My mother continued, stepping closer and lowering her voice to a frantic whisper. "He is willing to forgive everything. He said he will take you back and stop the divorce proceedings if you just withdraw your complaints and tell the feds you made a mistake with the accounting. You can drop all of this and go back to your beautiful house. Think of your children, Jasmine. Think of your children growing up without a father." I looked at the woman who had given birth to me with absolute pure disgust. All the years of trying to earn her approval and all the years of pretending to be the perfect obedient daughter completely dissolved in that parking lot. I realized she had never actually loved me. She only loved the access and the privilege that my marriage provided her. "You want me to protect a man who stole millions of dollars from federal relief funds?" I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. "You want me to go back to a man who cheated on me for years and abandoned his kids to buy a luxury house for his pregnant mistress? You want me to lie to the federal government and risk going to prison myself just so you can keep your name on a brass plaque and sit in the VIP row at church every Sunday?" Yvonne opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off, stepping directly into her personal space. "My children are not going to grow up without a parent," I said, staring right into her terrified eyes. "They have a parent. They have me. And I am going to make sure they never learn what it means to compromise their integrity for money. If you ever try to pull my kids out of school again, I will call the police and file a restraining order against you. Do not ever contact me again." I turned my back on her and walked toward my car. I could hear her crying and pleading behind me, but I did not stop. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I watched in the rearview mirror as my mother stood alone in the parking lot, finally realizing that she had chosen a corrupt family over her own daughter, and lost everything in the process. I drove away from the school feeling lighter than I had in years. I had officially severed the final string tying me to that toxic world. I turned onto the main road, heading back toward my apartment. My phone started ringing through the car speakers. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I hesitated for a second before tapping the screen to answer. Jasmine, the voice on the other end, was high-pitched and hyperventilating. It was Sierra. She was gasping for air, and I could hear loud, violent crashing sounds in the background. Someone was throwing heavy furniture and shattering glass against the walls. "Jasmine, what is Appendix B?" Sierra cried, her voice trembling with absolute terror. "Terrence just got home and he is completely out of his mind. He is tearing the entire house apart looking for the physical deed. He keeps screaming about Appendix B. What did you do?" I kept my eyes focused on the road ahead, listening to the sheer panic radiating from the voice of the woman who had enthusiastically helped destroy my marriage. Sierra was breathing so heavily, I could hear the sharp, desperate rasp of air scraping against her throat over the car speakers. In the background, there was a loud, echoing crash of breaking porcelain, followed by the sound of heavy furniture being overturned. Terrence was systematically destroying his own perfect sanctuary in a blind, frantic search for a piece of paper that would not save him. I pulled up to a red light and let the silence stretch for a few long seconds. I wanted Sierra to feel the absolute crushing weight of her own blinding greed. She had wanted everything I had built, and now she was getting exactly what she asked for in full. Appendix B. Sierra Y said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and smooth over the Bluetooth connection. "It is a very standard assumption of liability clause. It was clearly marked on the very last page of the settlement documents that your high-priced lawyers rushed through family court. They were so eager to evict me and secure your real estate portfolio that they did not even bother to read the fine print of the corporate transfer." I could hear Sierra whimpering on the other end of the line. She was completely clueless. She had never worked a real job in her entire life, and she certainly did not understand complex forensic corporate finance. She had just seen dollar signs and a massive luxury estate ready for her to claim. "When you stood in that courtroom and proudly demanded 100% ownership of the primary residence and the holding company, you did not just take the physical assets," I explained slowly, making sure she understood the gravity of every single word. "You legally assumed 100% of the corporate debts, the massive back taxes, and the millions of dollars in fraudulent federal loan liabilities attached to those entities." The phone line went completely dead quiet, except for the sound of Terrence throwing something metallic against a wall in the background. Sierra had actually stopped breathing. The reality of what she had eagerly signed was finally piercing through her thick, comfortable layer of entitlement. "You did not just steal a house, Sierra." I continued, pressing my foot down on the gas pedal as the light turned green. "You signed your name in permanent black ink to a massive federal crime. You willingly took total ownership of a toxic company that was actively being investigated by the Internal Revenue Service. You are the sole proprietor now. That makes you the primary legal target for the federal indictment. Sierra let out a loud, guttural sob that sounded like a wounded animal. She dropped the phone on a hard surface. The speakerphone echoed loudly as the device hit what sounded like the imported marble floor of the grand foyer. I could still hear everything happening perfectly clearly through the open microphone. I listened as Sierra turned and confronted the father of her unborn child. Her voice was shrill and echoing through the massive empty spaces of the luxury estate she had so desperately wanted to steal from me. "You told me it was free money," Sierra screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You promised me we were taking everything from her. You said the house was completely paid off and the company was making millions of dollars a year in profit. You made me sign those papers, Terrence. You set me up to take the fall for your stolen money." Terrence roared back at her, his voice completely devoid of the smooth, charming tone he used to manipulate vulnerable women. He sounded like a trapped, cornered rat. He blamed her for being stupid and impatient. He blamed her for demanding the house in her name just to secure her financial future before the baby arrived. He told her she was a greedy fool who should have hired better forensic accountants instead of just caring about the custom designer closets and the infinity swimming pool. Their toxic, perfect relationship was rapidly disintegrating live over the phone. They were viciously turning on each other the exact second the money disappeared. There was no actual loyalty between thieves. There was only desperate self-preservation and blind, consuming panic. I listened to them screaming and throwing horrific accusations back and forth while I drove past the local community park. The sun was shining brightly now, and the morning air felt incredibly crisp and clean. My life was finally moving forward into the light, while theirs was crashing headfirst into a solid brick wall. Sierra was sobbing hysterically, begging Terrence to call his powerful father to fix the mess. She was crying uncontrollably about going to federal prison and having her baby taken away by the state. Terrence was shouting that his father was already ruined and that there was absolutely no one left to call. The great untouchable Caldwell family was entirely out of political favors and dark money. Then the screaming abruptly stopped. A new terrifying sound echoed through the open phone line. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding coming from outside their massive front doors. It sounded like heavy tactical boots marching in unison across the stone porch. Sierra let out a confused, terrified whimper, asking Terrence who was outside. There was a brief moment of tense, dead silence. Then a massive, explosive crash physically shook the audio feed. The unmistakable sound of a heavy metal battering ram smashing completely through the thick custom oak front door echoed through my car speakers. The horrific sound of splintering wood and shattering decorative glass was absolutely deafening. "Federal agents," a deep, authoritative voice boomed over the ensuing chaos. "Hands exactly where we can see them right now. Get down on the floor. Do it now." Sierra screamed a high-pitched, piercing sound of pure, visceral terror. I heard the distinct sound of heavy tactical boots swarming the marble foyer. Armed men were shouting strict orders and rapidly securing the perimeter of the stolen mansion. Terrence yelled something defiant and unintelligible before the loud, violent sound of a physical scuffle broke out across the room. I drove my car into my designated parking spot at my apartment complex and smoothly put the vehicle in park. I sat in the quiet, safe sanctuary of my car listening to the chaotic symphony of absolute justice playing out over the phone line. I heard the harsh metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around wrists that had worn $50,000 watches just 24 hours ago. I reached forward and calmly pressed the red button on my dashboard screen to end the call. The sudden total silence in the car was incredibly beautiful. The Caldwells had casually taken my trust, my marriage, and my peace of mind. But I had systematically taken their empire, their freedom, and their arrogant belief that they could break innocent people without facing any consequences. The long, painful game was finally over, and the board was completely cleared. I sat in my car for a few more minutes, just breathing in the quiet peace of the morning. I knew exactly what was happening across town at that very moment. The federal authorities were executing their highly coordinated, simultaneous raids. At the massive Buckhead estate, Terrence was experiencing the brutal reality of his actions. I could easily picture the chaotic scene based on the audio feed I had just heard. He was being physically dragged out of his shattered custom front doors, wearing nothing but his expensive silk pajamas, his hands secured tightly behind his back. The FBI and IRS criminal investigation agents were swarming the pristine manicured lawns like a highly trained army. Sierra, heavily pregnant and completely hysterical, was left sobbing uncontrollably on the damp grass. She watched in absolute horror as federal agents carried out heavy cardboard boxes filled with physical ledgers and encrypted hard drives from the hidden basement safe. It was the exact safe Terrence thought no one else knew about. The same safe I had provided the precise location and access codes for in my detailed federal tip. The operation was a perfectly synchronized strike. Terrence was not the only one facing the harsh light of justice that morning. Across town at the towering glass and steel headquarters of Caldwell Enterprises, Harrison was living through his own personal nightmare. A completely separate team of federal agents had stormed his top-floor executive suite right in the middle of his morning staff meeting. I knew exactly how arrogant men like him reacted when they were finally cornered. Harrison had tried to throw his weight around immediately. He puffed out his chest and tried to pull his standard intimidation tactics. He raised his voice and told the lead federal agent that he knew the mayor personally and that he played golf with the governor. He threatened that heads would roll for this blatant disrespect. The lead agent simply ignored his empty threats and handed him a massive federal warrant. Harrison was forced to stand silently in the middle of his opulent office, while agents dismantled his entire legacy piece by piece. They seized private servers, confidential filing cabinets, and decades of fraudulent offshore tax returns. Local news helicopters were already circling overhead, capturing the spectacular downfall on live television. The great, untouchable Caldwell empire was crumbling brick by brick for the entire city to witness. But the absolute best part of the morning was knowing exactly where my mother was during all of this public devastation. Yvonne had driven straight from my children's school to her weekly society luncheon at the community church. She was sitting at a perfectly decorated banquet table, surrounded by the wealthy, elite women she had spent her entire life trying to impress. They were likely eating delicate finger sandwiches and drinking sweet tea when the emergency breaking news bulletin flashed across the massive flat-screen televisions in the fellowship hall. I could imagine the exact shade of pale her face turned as the local news anchor announced the massive federal indictment of the Caldwell family real estate firm. The humiliating footage of Terrence being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle in handcuffs was playing on a continuous loop for the whole room to see. The live aerial shots of the corporate headquarters being raided filled the screens. The entire congregation slowly turned in their seats to stare directly at Yvonne. The prestigious Caldwell name was being dragged through the absolute mud, and my mother was sitting right in the middle of the very people she had sold her soul to impress. Her perfect fabricated reputation was obliterated in a matter of seconds. Every lie she had told to elevate her social standing was now exposed on the noon broadcast. She had chosen greed over her own daughter, and now she had to sit in a room full of judging eyes and watch her precious elite status burn to the ground. The sterile fluorescent lights of the federal holding room buzzed with a low, annoying hum. The walls were painted a dull concrete gray, and the air was freezing cold. Terrence paced back and forth across the small room, still wearing his expensive silk pajamas that were now wrinkled and stained with dirt from the front lawn. Harrison sat at the metal table wearing his tailored custom suit. His tie was missing, and his top button was undone. The illusion of the great Caldwell patriarch was completely gone. He just looked like a tired, angry old man. "You sloppy, arrogant fool!" Harrison spat, slamming his fist against the metal table. "You had to flaunt the money. You had to buy that ridiculous luxury estate for your pregnant mistress. You left a trail of breadcrumbs so wide a blind man could follow it straight to the Cayman accounts." Terrence stopped pacing and turned on his father, his face red with pure rage. "Do not put this entirely on me," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Harrison. You built the shell companies, you set up the offshore routing architecture. You are the one who told me we were invincible as long as the political donations kept flowing. You got greedy with the federal relief funds and you dragged me into your massive financial scheme. They were viciously tearing each other apart. The legendary Caldwell family loyalty completely evaporated the absolute second the federal handcuffs clicked shut. They were no longer father and son. They were two cornered criminals, desperately trying to figure out how to throw the other one under the bus to secure a lighter prison sentence. The heavy steel door of the holding room suddenly clicked and swung open. Both men stopped yelling and immediately stood up straight. They smoothed their clothes and arranged their faces into their standard arrogant expressions, fully expecting to see their high-priced corporate defense attorney walking through the door to bail them out. Instead, a tall man wearing a dark federal windbreaker stepped into the room. It was the lead investigator for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. He walked in carrying a thick stack of manila folders and stood silently to the side. Then I walked into the room. I was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit and my favorite pearl earrings. I looked perfectly composed and utterly unbothered. Elijah, my brilliant attorney, walked in right behind me and gently closed the heavy steel door. The look of absolute shock that washed over the faces of my ex-husband and my former father-in-law was worth every single sleepless night I had endured over the past 2 years. Terrence lost whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. His eyes went wide and wild. He lunged across the small room, reaching his hands out toward me. "You set us up!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unhinged hysteria. "You vindictive witch! You planned this entire thing!" The federal agent stepped forward immediately, pressing his hand firmly against Terrence's chest and shoving him forcefully back into his metal chair. He ordered Terrence to remain seated and keep his hands flat on the table if he did not want to be physically restrained to the floor. Terrence collapsed into the chair, breathing heavily and staring at me with a mixture of intense hatred and absolute terror. I did not even flinch when he lunged at me. I calmly walked over to the opposite side of the metal table and sat down directly across from the men who had spent years trying to destroy my sanity and my self-worth. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, perfectly organized binder. It was 5 inches thick and filled with color-coded tabs, financial routing numbers, wire transfer receipts, and digital server logs. I dropped the heavy binder onto the center of the metal table with a loud, echoing thud. "No, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and cold. "Your ego set you up. Your greed and your arrogance set you up. I just provided the math." Harrison stared at the massive binder, his eyes darting wildly between the pages and my face. He opened his mouth to speak, but he could not find a single word. He finally realized the absolute sheer magnitude of what I had done. I had not just hacked a few bank accounts. I had systematically documented a decade of their multi-million-dollar federal fraud and handed it over to the government on a silver platter. I had built the very tracking software they used to hide the money, which meant I knew exactly how to dismantle it line by line. Elijah stood behind me with a quiet, satisfied smile on his face. He nodded to the lead IRS agent who stepped forward to the edge of the table. The agent did not read them their rights again. He did not ask them any questions about the offshore accounts or the fake shell companies. He simply reached into his manila folder and pulled out a single crisp piece of paper. He slid the paper slowly across the smooth metal table until it stopped directly in front of Harrison. The old man looked down at the document, his hands shaking slightly, as he read the bold black letters printed across the very top of the page. It was IRS Form 211, the official federal application for award for original information. I watched the last drop of blood drain from Harrison's face as the lead agent explained exactly what the document meant. He told them that I was not just a cooperating witness. I was the official registered federal whistleblower who had initiated the entire investigation. I was legally entitled to receive a massive percentage of every single dollar the federal government recovered from their fraudulent empire. I was about to become incredibly wealthy using the exact same money they had tried to steal from me, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. The lead agent stood in complete silence as Harrison stared down at the official IRS document. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cold metal table. I looked directly into Terrence's eyes, making sure he understood every single detail of his absolute ruin. When you commit $12 million in federal loan fraud, I explained, my voice echoing in the small concrete room. The Internal Revenue Service is very grateful to the person who maps it out for them. The federal government does not take corporate tax evasion lightly, but they love a neat paper trail. Under the federal whistleblower program, I am legally entitled to up to 30% of the recovered funds and the criminal fines. Terrence stopped breathing. His face turned a sickly shade of gray as the reality of my words finally processed in his brain. He looked at me, then looked down at his wrinkled silk pajamas, and then looked over at his father, who was still staring blankly at the whistleblower form. I watched the exact moment the trap clamped shut around Terrence's mind. He finally realized the absolute brilliance of my exit strategy. By aggressively fighting me in family court and proudly demanding 100% ownership of the Buckhead mansion and the holding company, he had willingly absorbed the entirety of the criminal charges. He thought he was leaving me destitute and homeless, but he was actually volunteering to take the sole legal fall for a massive federal conspiracy. And by quietly doing the forensic accounting and handing the files to the IRS, became a millionaire completely legally. The federal government was literally going to pay me millions of dollars using the exact same assets they had just seized from Terrence's bank accounts. "You did this to us," Terrence whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "You let me take the house. You let me take the company. You knew they were coming for it all along." I just smiled at him, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace. "I did not force you to sign those fraudulent loan applications, Terrence," I said softly. "I did not force you to sleep with Sierra or funnel company money to offshore shell accounts. I just stopped covering up your mistakes. You dug this grave completely by yourself, and I just handed the federal agents the shovel." Harrison suddenly slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. The great, untouchable patriarch of the Caldwell family was broken. He had spent his entire life building an empire on lies and intimidation, and it had all been dismantled by the daughter-in-law he thought was too weak to fight back. Elijah placed a hand on my shoulder, signaling that our part in this interrogation was officially over. We had delivered the documents and confirmed the evidence. There was nothing left to do but watch them face the brutal consequences of their own greed. The lead IRS agent opened the heavy steel door to escort us out of the holding room. We walked down the brightly lit corridor of the federal precinct, heading toward the main processing area. The precinct was buzzing with chaotic activity. Uniformed officers and federal agents were moving quickly through the halls, carrying boxes of seized evidence and directing suspects through the intake process. As we approached the main booking desk, the heavy glass double doors of the precinct slid open. Two federal marshals walked into the room escorting two new prisoners. It was Brooke and Jamal. They were both wearing tight metal handcuffs, their wrists bound together in front of them. Brooke's expensive designer dress was torn, and her perfect hair was a wild, tangled mess. Jamal looked like he was about to pass out from sheer panic, his eyes darting frantically around the busy police station. They were being guided toward the fingerprinting station when Brooke suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes locked onto me as I stood calmly next to my attorney, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. She struggled against the federal marshal, holding her arm, pulling against the heavy metal cuffs. "You!" Brooke screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing violently across the crowded precinct. "You did this to us. You ruined my life, you vindictive, jealous trash. I am going to destroy you, Jasmine. I am going to make you pay for everything." The federal marshal yanked her arm hard, forcing her to stop struggling, but she continued to shriek and curse at me. Every single person in the booking area turned to stare at the hysterical woman screaming in her designer clothes. I did not flinch or look away. I simply stood there, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of justice settling over the room. I took one step forward, closing the distance between us just slightly. I looked at the heavy steel handcuffs digging into her wrists, and then I looked right into her wild, hateful eyes. I smiled a slow, calm smile that made her screaming falter for just a fraction of a second. "Watch your tone, Brooke," I said, my voice perfectly clear and steady over the noise of the precinct. I turned my back to her and walked smoothly out of the heavy glass doors, letting her chaotic screaming fade away behind me. 6 months passed since that glorious morning at the federal precinct, and the heavy wheels of justice had ground the entire Caldwell empire into absolute fine dust. The long, painful legal proceedings were over, and the consequences were finalized with brutal permanent efficiency. Harrison's decades-old real estate empire was completely dismantled by the government. His massive commercial properties and luxury developments were auctioned off to the highest bidder for absolute pennies on the dollar. The prestigious Caldwell name that he had built his entire arrogant identity around was permanently erased from the sides of buildings across the city. He was left with absolutely nothing but a mountain of legal debt and a shattered legacy. Terrence was no longer lounging in silk pajamas or driving imported sports cars. He was currently sitting in a tiny concrete cell in a federal penitentiary, serving a mandatory 8-year sentence without any possibility of early parole. His smooth, charming manipulation tactics were completely useless behind thick iron bars. He was just another federal inmate wearing a standard-issue uniform and stripped of all his unearned privilege. Sierra found out exactly what it meant to assume total liability. She was no longer living in a custom luxury estate with marble floors. The federal government had seized the Buckhead mansion to pay off the massive fraudulent loans she had eagerly signed her name to. Now she was living in a cramped aluminum trailer in a rundown park on the far outskirts of the city. I heard she was working grueling double shifts at a local discount retail store, standing on her feet all day, just to make the minimum monthly payments on the crushing IRS debts she had legally assumed through Appendix B. The blind greed that made her steal my home had left her with absolutely nothing. My mother Yvonne experienced her own special kind of prison. She was unceremoniously stripped of all her prestigious church titles and board positions. The elite wealthy women she had worshipped and sacrificed her own daughter to impress completely iced her out. She was an absolute social pariah in Atlanta, unable to even show her face at the local grocery store without people pointing and whispering. I knew she had eventually realized the horrific gravity of her choices. I checked my blocked call logs and saw that she had tried to call me dozens of times, begging for forgiveness and desperately asking for financial help. But all she got was an automated voice telling her that my number was permanently disconnected. I stepped out onto the sprawling glass balcony of my brand new $3 million penthouse in Midtown Atlanta. The warm evening breeze brushed against my face, bringing the sweet scent of the city. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, I could hear the incredibly beautiful sound of my children laughing and running across the massive open-concept living room. They were safe and deeply loved and completely free from the toxic expectations of the Caldwell family. I looked down at the thick, textured paper I was holding loosely in my hand. It was an official letter from the United States Treasury Department. Tucked inside the heavy envelope was a freshly printed federal check made out directly to me for exactly $3.6 million. It was my official whistleblower reward for mapping out the fraud and handing the government the exact keys to the Caldwell criminal empire. I set the paper down on the patio table and picked up a delicate crystal glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip of an incredibly expensive vintage wine. It was the exact same label and the exact same year of the wine Brooke had once coldly told me to leave behind because I supposedly did not know how to appreciate the finer things. The complex, rich flavors danced perfectly on my tongue, tasting remarkably like absolute victory. I leaned my hands against the cool glass railing and looked out over the glowing, glittering Atlanta skyline. The city lights stretched out for miles in every direction, pulsing with bright, vibrant energy. They had tried to burn my entire world to the ground just to keep their dark secrets hidden and force me into submission. But I did not just survive their fire. I owned the absolute ashes. The night sky felt incredibly vast and full of endless bright possibilities as the world around me slowly faded to black. The most profound lesson from this journey is that true security and self-worth never come from seeking the approval of toxic people. When those closest to you show their true colors through betrayal and blinding greed, you must believe them. Walking away from manipulative family dynamics is never a failure. It is the ultimate act of reclaiming your own power. True justice is not about bitter revenge. It is about building your own unshakable independence and letting the natural consequences of their deceit completely dismantle their lives while you thrive in absolute peace. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to finally discover your true worth? Share your empowering story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more journeys of resilience and absolute justice.